Welcome back to the Balancing Act podcast. I'm Andy Temte. On the Balancing Act, we talk to business leaders and industry experts to explore the balancing acts we play in our professional lives and learn about the events that put rocket boosters behind their career success. Today, we have Melissa Doman joining us. Melissa is an organizational psychologist, a former mental health therapist, founder of the Workplace Mental Health Method, author of Yes, You Can Talk About Mental Health at Work. Her new book is Cornered Office, Why We Need to Talk About Leadership Mental Health. And I would like to welcome you to the show today, Melissa.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to it.
Excellent. Please give our listeners the elevator pitch version of your story.
So I am an organizational psychologist, former therapist. I won't analyze you in our discussion, don't worry. I specialize in teaching companies, leaders, and individuals the skill set to talk about mental health, intentional communication, and team dynamics in the workplace. So my clients are organizations. They range from really large companies like Google, Dow Jones, Estee Lauder, to mid-sized companies like Orlando City Soccer Club, to small companies, everything in between and around the world. And, I have just been really focusing on equipping people with the language they need, because awareness of mental health at work is not enough. People need the conversational literacy to be able to discuss it. On a personal level, I love coffee. I do a banging Chewbacca impression, as you already mentioned. And I've been to 50 countries with the goal of 100 by the time I leave this pale blue dot that's floating around the universe.
All right. Well, love the pale blue dot analogy. I've in my first book, I go full Carl Sagan.
I'm so happy you got that.
Oh yeah, I go full Carl Sagan
I love it.
in my first book. So excellent. Mel, if you had to pick one event in your life that was just a key accelerant for your career, what would that be?
Oh gosh, I can pinpoint it to the day and the conversation, actually. There was a contract that I was working on for people in leadership development. And as that contract was ending, and I wasn't self-employed yet, I was speaking with someone that was working there who said, your passion for mental health at work is clear. Don't do this more traditional in-house L&D stuff, because that's not where your heart is. And at the time, I was scared to hear that, because being self-employed can be hard and scary. But that was the best push I could have ever gotten to step out on my own and to step into that subspecialization of mental health at work. Because at the time I was doing traditional org psych, which I still do, around emotional intelligence, intentional communication, constructive conflict, all the ways to help people share their toys a bit better in the workplace. But that was the push I didn't know I needed at the time. And that's what did it for me. That was in 2018, I believe.
Excellent. Most of us have those push stories that we can tell, and I appreciate you telling yours. Let's start with your first book. Yes, You Can Talk About Mental Health at Work. Many people would still say, no, you can't talk about mental health at work.
Correct.
So if a reader could only take one thing away from that book, what would you want the message to be?
So the subtitle is part of it. So the subtitle to Yes, You Can Talk About Mental Health at Work, here's why and how to do it really well. The one thing I want people to take away is it is so difficult out in the world and really difficult in our heads, and often both at the same time. You can't survive living today and what is expected of us without being able to talk about the struggles you have in the place that you spend the most time each week and with the people you spend each week. So what I would say is, if you want to talk about mental health at work, do that back end reflection with yourself. what do I want to share? Why do I want to share it? Who do I want to share it with? What do I want them to do with this information? What am I prepared to do with this information? And do I work at a place where I can actually have this conversation? Or has this workplace told me it is not safe to have this conversation? So determine why you want to talk about mental health at work, what you want to achieve from that conversation, and if you can actually do it where you currently work.
Thank you for that. How do you help people build that self-talk muscle? Because that's one that I find is frankly the hardest, because
Yeah.
our worst critic lives right here in between our own ears,
Yeah.
constantly berating us. You're not worthy, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
So how, you talk about constructive conflict, effective
Hmm.
communication.
Yeah.
How do you help people do that with themselves?
This might sound a little crunchy, but I have found it to be demonstrably true over and over again throughout my career. The power of narrative is really amazing and also destructive. So I think that we're on autopilot so often that we not only don't pause to think, well, why do I believe these things? Where did these messages come from? Do I have to believe these things? Now, it's a very scary process to explore what else you could think about yourself and why, but people get so attached to the stories they tell about themselves that it can be very difficult to recognize that that's what it is. It's a story, and the fact that you can change that. I mean, I had some stories that I used to tell myself about myself, and it wasn't until I met my husband 13 years ago when I said certain things and he physically put his hands on my shoulders and said, "You're never allowed to say that about yourself again." And I was like, "Oh, okay." So yeah, the power of narrative, I think just recognizing that it's their stories we tell ourselves and remembering where they come from and that we can change it.
Well, I like to run mentorship moments. We're going to run two of them back to
Great.
back right now. And the first mentorship moment is the stigma of talking about mental health is alive and well in most
Mhm.
circles today.
Mhm.
Suppose that you've got a mid-level manager in a large company sitting right in front of you right now, and they want to make conversations about mental health more acceptable in
Mhm.
their part of the business. They don't know where to start, and they're worried about what upper level management is going to think about this aspiration. How do you counsel this individual?
Well, the first thing I would want to know is if they're concerned about what upper level management would think, why is that? Does that concern come from demonstrable evidence around them that upper level management is not willing to have these conversations? Or does that concern come internally from that person where it's unfamiliar, so they get nervous? So I would first recommend that they answer that question. If it's the former, then it comes into showing irrefutable data and logic to upper level management and saying, you don't understand, this is not optional, this is not a nice to have, this is critical based on how people function in our organization to perform the way we're asking them to. And we're not trying to become therapists, we're just trying to have a shared nomenclature about how people support one another, refer to other resources as necessary, and people will show their opinions with their feet by going to other organizations that do talk about this readily. So sometimes you got to convince people because it doesn't matter that we know better. Some people don't want to do better. And then if it comes to the fact that they're concerned just within themselves, again, I would say, well, the fact you're feeling concerned is not about the workplace. Why do you feel that way? Is that concern stopping you from having these conversations? And so before I even encourage people to go into these conversations and, after they do the reflections I was already talking about, I think that it's good to start with talking about mental health as a concept as opposed to what you're disclosing about yourself. So let me give an example. Let's say that the manager is trying to embed the conversations into everyday life. It doesn't have to be this huge thing. It could be even just a teachable moment, let's say that they hear someone saying something ignorant about mental health or something like that. It could be as simple as, well, people who talk about mental health and try to get help are really emotionally intelligent. So I don't think we should say things like that when that's not true. Just simple things like that, simple teachable moments. Again, encouraging people to question the narrative that they have around mental health and mental illness, because that's a lot of what we're doing, even before the disclosures, is reorienting how people view this deeply personal topic and the framework of that in the workplace.
Yeah. And where do you recommend they get started and get more educated? Is it picking up your first book? Where else?
I would recommend that. I make the joke, I've seen the front end and the back end because I used to be a therapist, and then, I went into org psych and I see what it all looks like on the front end. I'm married to someone in tech, so I often make those back end, front end jokes. So in my first book, in addition to teaching people how to talk about it and why, there is a lot of information, peer-reviewed, valid, researched information, you gotta say that these days, where it talks about what mental health is, what mental illness is, how it's been treated throughout history, how it's influenced by culture and gender and ethnicity and all of these deeply personal things, and helping people realize that mental health literally, biologically, is something we all share, where they often tend to use the terms mental health and mental illness interchangeably when they shouldn't. So there is a ton of baseline foundational education so people actually understand the topic that is often so, ambiguous and vague, so they can understand their relation to it, and then therefore how to talk about it. So it's really a playbook with a foundation of education to get people started. So that came out in 2021. So it's a really good precursor to the second book. And there's also a lot of information available online through NAMI, National Association of Mental Illness. There's also the American Psychological Association. Any of those really trusted places will have tons of medically reviewed, peer-reviewed information that people can use.
And we'll avoid 20-second clips on TikTok, right?
Oh, I refuse to even open a TikTok account. I will not get involved in that. I already am on Instagram too much,
Yeah.
but I just can't join in that space because for so many reasons that today is not about. Yes, don't get this information from TikTok and social media. Go to trusted, validated research sites driven by healthcare and behavioral healthcare professionals.
Excellent. Well, let's run our second mentorship moment. Now you have a skeptical C-suite leader sitting in front of you who grew up in what I like to call everybody comes to work in an emotional suit of armor, right? Plunking around, their eyes roll in the back of their head when they hear the phrase mental health. How would you approach this individual to just crack the door open to engage in a productive conversation about investing in mental well-being?
I love how you phrased that question. I think that it really comes down to starting with curiosity. Now, often different generations will finger point at each other in the workplace when it comes to topics like this. And we all logically know that doesn't work, but people still do it because they get frustrated. So we can't discount the fact that the C-suite person did along the space-time continuum, grow up in that time with certain social rules and, permission or lack thereof to have this conversation. We can't fault this person for growing up in that time. What we can do is be curious about why they're insisting that other people remain in that time when that is not the current reality. So I would want to know, well, what makes you roll your eyes at it? I don't want to assume. I want to understand, what is it about this topic that you think is unimportant and that you don't like, because the current validated research and data shows return on investment and that talking about mental health is good for business. So help me understand, based in data and based in research, why you disagree. And typically speaking, they'll say, well, I don't want to open Pandora's box. I don't want to turn into a therapist. And I go, that's not the goal. And if you're doing this in a sustainable way, you're explaining why people are talking about it, what the purpose of the conversation is and is not, emphasis on the latter. It's about creating sustainable conversations so that people can get the help they need and so they can support each other and have less crises, better communication, etc., and really helping them understand that it is a core strategic business priority, not an optional wellness thing. And so it's often driven by these personal biases or even fear of the unknown, because there are plenty of mental health conversations that don't go well for lots of reasons. And so a lot of it is fear-based, avoidance-based. I get that. So you need to validate that those concerns are valid. However, not reasonable enough to avoid doing it. So I would really approach it with that sort of curiosity, and I haven't lost anybody yet.
That's wonderful. We're going to take a really short commercial break, and we'll be right back with Melissa Doman talking about mental health in the workplace. Want to understand money, markets, and the economy to make better financial decisions? I'm Andy Temte. Join me every Saturday morning for Money Lessons with Andrew Temte on YouTube or your favorite podcast streaming service. And we're back with Melissa Doman talking about mental health in the workplace. Mel, take us into your new book, Cornered Office. Before we cut to a break, the word that was going around in my head as you were talking about that C-suite executive is the word shame. Many leaders kind of, if I talk about my own mental health, there's this whole shame. You're the leader. It's not supposed to happen to you. I look back at my time in the CEO chair, that whole cornered office metaphor that you're using really rings true. So if I can pick up your book, but I can only take one thing away, what do you want that takeaway to be?
Despite popular opinion, leadership titles do not and should not dehumanize the humans that hold them. It is absurd that we build up leaders to be something different as if they are a different species and that their needs are different for support just because of a job title. And so if we want leaders to do better, if we want them to show up for us, to lead us, especially in the ways that we need to these days, it is unsustainable and ridiculous not to give them the same psychological contract to be honored, that they can talk about their struggles and get the help they need when it is commonly understood but not socially acceptable that struggles and success coexist in leadership.
I talk a lot about the concept of the accidental manager. These are individual contributors who get tapped on the shoulder. Oh, you're doing a great job. Do you want to manage 10 people? And they're like, sure. And then the reality hits and they go, oh my God, all the anxiety. I'm an imposter in my own story. What's happening here? So how do we set those accidental managers up for success? I would love to have somebody do a research study on accidental managers and future mental health challenges.
Well, I think that there's a missing conversation when people are put into management roles because of good performance. There's a missing element to inquire with them about, how do you feel? I know this is not a word we're supposed to use in the workplace. How do you feel about not just taking on the additional responsibility, but the additional stress that will come as a leader? Do you feel prepared to take care of yourself, whatever that looks like for you, as you make that transition, because this transition will have an impact on you? But that conversation doesn't really happen, because if people say they're concerned or they're worried, the automatic assumption is I won't get the promotion. I won't get the job if I show the concern. When showing the concern is what everybody feels on the inside, I'm just encouraging them to say the quiet part out loud. So there is I think that's a huge miss to not set them up for success by understanding where they are, and that if they're concerned, okay, here are the things you need to do to prepare as you make this transition. And then if and when you hit obstacles, you have concerns, etc., these are the resources to help you through this transitional time. Because I these skills are not soft skills. They are critical skills. And I think that is a way to set people up for success as they make that transition, but they have to be made to feel psychologically safe enough to be honest. Not that it's what's the term? Like it's like they're being set up. Some people get concerned that they're being set up, that if they're honest, that they won't get the gig.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I get that. I do.
Yeah. So here in early 2026, what's the most prominent challenge that's dragging leaders down mentally, and they're really not going to talk about this thing to anyone in their circles, even their close confidants? What's your advice to help leaders become less averse to striking up a conversation and who they should confide in?
Honestly, I think it's their fear of being canceled on the internet. Yeah. There's a lot of leaders out there doing a lot of bad stuff. A lot. And when you're in a position of power and influence, and this has been this way for millennia, there has historically been this us versus them. And when you're in a position of power, there are lots of feelings that bring up for people when you manage them, especially if people feel like they don't have, certain levels of control or over their job, that's all normal when people feel like that. However, there are the good leaders that feel if they say one wrong thing, if they do one wrong thing, that they will be plastered all over the internet with no context, with people who are saying it's call out culture, but it's actually cancel culture. And there is a difference. And I go into that in chapter 4 of the book. I've had leaders hyperventilating to me in coaching sessions, crying in workshops where they feel like all it takes is one misstep. And even if they don't misstep, that it's never enough. They're not giving enough. And within that, there's no space for themselves, because there are companies where those disclosures will be weaponized against them, because again, going back to narrative, we have a narrative problem. I wrote in the book about one person who is in the VP level, where they were saying they're having a tough time recently with anxiety, but that they're working on it, and they wanted to explain why they were acting that way to the people in the meeting. And a more junior person then took the next day off, emailed the leader and said, I don't feel comfortable working because of what you said yesterday.
Mm.
Just the ultimate weaponization. So that's why these sorts of changes there are multiple things that need to happen at the same time, where we need to shift this narrative about leaders so they can then shift the narrative about themselves. And in addition to that, working on changing the support structures in the workplace. It all has to happen simultaneously, and there's a lot of work to do. So that's what I'd say.
Yeah, I'm hearing an undertone of this all works in organizations that are founded on a culture of trust balanced with accountability.
Oh, yeah.
And
Oh, yeah.
people hear me talk about that balancing act all the time of between trust and accountability. And if I got to imagine that if you don't have that in your workplace, that this gets really tough.
Oh, 100%. And the thing is, we're not just encouraging leaders to talk about their mental health. We're encouraging them to say how they're managing their mental health. And talking about mental health and leadership is not an excuse for bad behavior in leadership. Got to make that very clear. but to humanize themselves to the people they lead and to show how they are taking responsibility to manage themselves and also to be realistic about their capacity. It's like they're not allowed. And obviously that happens to individual contributors too. I'm not twisted about that. But there is just so much work to do around that. And even if you think about Patrick Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team, what's at the base? It's trust. And so I completely agree that there has to be trust and there has to be accountability that, we don't choose to have mental health struggles or to have a mental illness, but we choose what to do about it, provided we have access to resources and can afford to use them.
I had Patrick on the show for episodes 150 and 151.
You did?
Yeah. He was a lovely interview. But
Oh,
I just bought the 5 dysfunctions
huh?
for our eldest son, who just got tapped on the shoulder, accidental manager. And in my
Oh,
first book, I say, the 5 dysfunctions of a team is the book that I give to everybody that gets that
yeah,
shoulder tap, right?
yeah.
So, and I looked it up. 5 dysfunctions of a team is ranked number 69 in all books on Amazon.
Doesn't
And
surprise
it
me.
was written back in the early 2000s, right? So,
Yeah,
congratulations to Mr. Lencioni for that
yeah.
staying power of that book.
I'm sure his follow-up book, The 5 Behaviors, is also pretty high up there as well.
Yeah, he's a wonderful exemplar for us all. So,
That's wonderful.
um, next question, take us behind
Okay.
the scenes of a recent success story in a company that you've been working with. You don't have to mention any names, but
Mhm.
what was the journey like from, yeah, we'll engage, but we're really skeptical, blah, 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 to holy cow, this is really a game changer? What was the key to that shift?
I think the key to the shift is when they were seeing the changes in the conversations, the changes in the disclosures. Now, there are a number of companies that I've been working with for years, because it's not a one and done, it is an evolution. And I remember working with a company, and this is for a broader mental health program. And obviously, there were programs within that for leadership. It was an 18-month program. And at the beginning, people were pretty cagey, pretty nervous. And the way it started to shift is that folks in HR and also leaders started emailing me saying, "You're not going to believe what people are starting to talk about." And they didn't say who, but they started to give me examples about conversations that were brought to HR that were happening between employees, between leader and team, leader to leader. And I was getting emails, like it started maybe a month or two into the program. And I started getting emails almost every week. "You're not gonna believe what happened. You're not gonna believe what happened." And I was like, I'm so proud I could cry. So it's really the subjects that start to come up, the conversations that start to come up, people's reactions to those conversations. Because once, I'm yakking at them, I'm giving them this education, it doesn't show that it hits until the conversations start changing and people's opinions start to shift. So after I started getting those emails, then I start hearing from those same people saying, I didn't realize how much we needed to have these conversations. And I'm so happy they're happening. So that client in particular is one of my gold star clients. They really put the work in.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you for sharing that. We're going to have a little fun to close out the show. I got 3 lightning round questions for you.
Okay.
All right, Melissa Doman, you've just won $100 million lotto jackpot, but there's a stipulation that half of your net winnings go to one philanthropic organization or a general cause. Who do you pick?
Gosh. Probably the ASPCA. I have such a soft spot for animals and rescues, and We have 2 rescues ourselves, and it just breaks my heart how many animals don't have homes, they don't have access to the right care, how many animals are euthanized and put down, and it just breaks me inside. So, be ASPCA.
Well, I'm going to try to get a twofer out of this one, and you can absolutely decline my request. But if I give you access to a time machine and you can send a message to an earlier version of Melissa Doman in Chewbacca voice, what would the message be, and what previous version of yourself would you send it to?
I don't know if I can speak in Chewbacca voice. I can only do the like gurgling
Oh,
sound.
oh, okay,
So that'll
fine,
have to be
fine,
done
fine.
separately.
All
But
right.
I think the message I would send to myself, it would probably be in my early 20s. And because I was, like most people in their 20s don't know their ass from their elbow. And you're really still figuring out who you are. Your brain's not even done cooking till you're at least 26. And that's on the early side. So I think I would say to myself, it's not about fitting into a mold. It's about doing things the way you feel they need to be done because no one else will do it that way. So stick to your guns, stay strong. This is the path that you need to go on, and don't let anybody make you think otherwise. So I think I would have really appreciated hearing that when I was like 22.
Some Melissa, we're all works in progress. I'm sure you're working on something right now for yourself.
Oh, yeah.
What is that? What are you focused on in your journey of growth?
Ah, you know, a lot of people actually in the last year have been telling me that I don't pause to appreciate what I have accomplished. And I think that's because there's so many people who are very braggadocious about it, the things that they do, and I don't really like people like that. So I'm trying to get better at pausing and observing the journey about what I have accomplished, especially in the last 8 years. And when I sit and I look and I go, "Oh my God," like, I never would have thought I would have had 2 books by 40, and, like, I've been on the news recently, and I'm self-employed, I have a team, like, I never would have thought that in my early 20s. So, yeah, just trying to pause and appreciate the accomplishments.
Mel, it's been lovely having you on the show. Where can people get a hold of you?
I've really enjoyed this conversation too. Thank you so much. Best place to find me, my website's very difficult. It's melissadoman.com. If you would like me to do fireside interviews, workshops, trainings, consulting, please get in touch. I'm a very spicy meatball when it comes to talking about this stuff, and I like it to be skills-based, practical, and action-oriented. You can also add me on LinkedIn, and on Instagram, I'm at The Wandering Mel. And both of my titles for the books are available across all major retailers.
Thank you so much for joining us today and your contributions to our listeners.
Thank you.
All right. Well, my name is Andy Temte. This is the Balancing Act podcast. You can find us on all the major streaming services as well as out on YouTube. Please like, subscribe, rate, and most importantly, share this public good with your friends, your family, your colleagues, and maybe a neighbor. The show was produced by Nick Temte, and we'll see you next time on The Balancing Act.